Put the epicenter on a map. Start at the Pacific coast, off Michoacán, where the seafloor grinds down under the continent. Follow the land inland, over mountains, across hard rock, more than 200 miles, until the line reaches Mexico City. From that far out, the capital had every reason to survive. Distance usually drains the sharpest motion out of a quake. The rupture began offshore at 7:17 a.m. The USGS catalogs it near magnitude 8.0. Older Mexican records often gave 8.1. By around 7:19, when the long-period waves reached the capital, the difference no longer mattered. Even at that size, traveling that distance, it should have arrived as a long, slow roll that most structures could handle. The worst of it still happened in the capital. Hundreds of buildings came down, and the pattern they left was the first clue. Walk the center afterward, and you would find a block standing almost untouched. Then the next building folded into slabs and dust. Same era, similar concrete, sometimes the same street. The destruction was sorted by a rule no one could read from the surface. The failed buildings shared a profile. The tallest towers mostly survived. Many low buildings survived as well. The heaviest failure gathered in the middle, roughly 6 to 20 stories, shaken apart while neighboring structures rode out the same morning. The rule that sorted them sounds too small for ruins this large. 2 seconds. The key is a lake that disappeared from the map centuries ago, and a rhythm the ground under the old city has never stopped keeping. Down in Tlatelolco, a long apartment block called Nuevo León was still standing at 7:19 that morning. The block stood 15 or 16 stories high, divided into 3 sections above an open ground floor that was far more flexible than the mass of apartments stacked above it. In a few seconds, those sections would begin to move, and they would not move together. That building is where the lake bed rhythm found the geometry it needed. The explanation, though, runs through the ground beneath the city. Mexico City sits on the bones of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital built on islands in Lake Texcoco. The Spanish built over it. Over the centuries that followed, the city pumped and drained and filled until the open lake disappeared from every map. The water left, the clay stayed. Under the old center, that clay goes down roughly 200 feet before it reaches anything solid, the depth of a 20-story building, all of it soft and saturated. Engineers surveyed this ground after the disaster and confirmed what geologists had suspected. The old lake floor at the city's heart formed the softest, most dangerous ground zone in the basin. They called it Zone 3. The historic core of the city sits directly inside it. On a modern street map, Lake Texcoco is gone, but when engineers overlaid the post-earthquake damage surveys on the old lake boundaries, Texcoco came back, this time drawn in collapsed buildings. A field inventory drawing on assessments by UNAM and the U.S. National Bureau of Standards counted more than 5,700 structures with heavy damage. Nearly all of them sat on the former lakebed. As the seismic energy traveled inland, the sharp, fast jolts faded. They always do over long distances. The slower, rolling motion held. By the time the wave train reached the Valley of Mexico, that deep, rhythmic energy was what survived the crossing. Wet ground can also fail another way. Liquefaction, the way Alaska 1964 collapsed, where soil loses strength entirely and the ground begins to slide. Mexico City's wreckage doesn't tell that story. In the soft clay of the old lake, the motion did something different. It slowed, swelled, and stayed. The basin trapped part of that energy and pushed it back into the deposits. The lake bed kept shaking long after the first wave should have passed. One instrument measured what that meant. On firm ground elsewhere in the city, the seismograph logged horizontal acceleration at around 4% of the force of gravity. Serious shaking, but the kind most modern buildings are designed to survive. At SCT, the strong motion station sitting directly on the deep lakebed clay, the same earthquake hit 0.17 G, more than 4 times as strong. Same rupture, same morning, different ground. Those figures come from the National Bureau of Standards' technical analysis of the disaster. The acceleration matters, but the shape of the motion matters more. The SCT record shows energy piling up around one rhythm, a full sway out and back every 2 seconds. In the worst lakebed districts, that rhythm held for roughly 3 minutes, and every new wave hit buildings already weaker than they had been 30 seconds before. That rhythm brings the question back to that long block in Tlatelolco. Every structure has a natural sway, the rhythm it wants to return to after it's pushed. Mexico City had filled that old lake floor with mid-rise buildings, and many of them swayed at almost exactly the pace the lakebed was now forcing. When those two rhythms align, each new wave arrives at the right moment to push a little harder than the last. The shaking builds. The frame absorbs more than it was built to hold. It doesn't need extraordinary force, it needs repetition. At that point, the damage map stops looking random and starts to read like an instrument. The addresses are tests of that mechanism, not a tour of ruins. Nuevo León puts that physics into walls and floors. The block was 15 or 16 stories. Engineers use a rough shortcut, about 1/10 of a second per story, which puts a building that height at roughly 1.5 to 1 6/10 seconds. Short of 2, but the shortcut is only a starting point. An open ground floor, uneven mass distribution, and the interaction between 3 sections moving under the same roof, all of it shifts the real number. The actual rhythm of that frame could sit closer to the 2-second band than the story count alone suggests. Push a child on a swing at the wrong moment, and most of your effort fights the motion. Push at the right moment, and small shoves stack into a much larger arc. A 15-story building obeys the same rule, with far more mass and far less mercy. The open ground floor made it worse. That soft story, the weakest level carrying the weight and distortion from everything above, concentrated the flexibility at the base, where the columns had the least help from the structure around them. As the block swayed, its 3 sections moved out of step and struck one another. The columns sheared. The vertical path for the floors above disappeared. 2 sections pancaked. The 2-second rhythm was now moving through kitchens, stairwells, bedrooms, and corridors. Oscar Flores and Rebecca Orozco rode the building down into a pocket under a doorway. A falling slab crushed Oscar's left hand above the wrist. In the dark, Rebecca found the wound by touch and tied it off. The two of them lasted close to 5 days before rescuers reached them. 9 minutes before the shaking, 3 boys from one family had left that same building to wait for a school bus outside. 9 minutes put them outside the collapse zone. Pino Suárez, near the historic center, was steel. 21 stories. Steel is supposed to be forgiving. It bends, gives, absorbs energy. But a strong material still has to work in the right regime. Driven into long period sway through the extended duration of the shaking, the lower columns took savage alternating loads. The joints and welds were forced through cycles they were not built to sustain that long. As connections yielded and joints loosened, the frame lost stiffness, the kind of progressive degradation that can push a damaged structure toward the very pulse it is already fighting. The tower buckled and came down sideways onto a 14-story building beside it. One detail from the wreckage gives the speed of collapse a human scale. An architect working through the debris found a man's arm between two flattened slabs, the hand still gripping a telephone receiver. Not enough time to run. Not enough time even to release the phone. Proof that a steel building can be strong in exactly the wrong way. San Antonio Abad, the garment district, adds another layer. Here, the physics ran into labor. Mid-rise buildings intended for light commercial use had been packed floor to floor with industrial sewing machines, fabric, and hundreds of workers. That unlogged weight overloaded columns and pulled the building's periods closer to the lakebed rhythm. Survivor accounts collected in the weeks after the earthquake by publications including Proceso and La Jornada described locked doors and blocked escape routes in a number of workshops. The evidence does not turn every workshop into the same story, and it should not. The core is already ugly enough. Structural risk and labor risk had been stacked into the same floors. When some of those buildings went, they went flat, with almost nothing left between one floor and the next. The risk lesson sits in the pattern. Distance was a poor measure of danger. The crucial amplifier sat directly under the Capitol, in the shape of a lake nobody alive had seen, while attention stayed on a rupture more than 200 miles out at sea. The event was not a clean surprise. In 1957, another quake had already damaged mid-rise buildings on these same soft soils. By 1976, the building code had mapped the lake zone. Engineers knew the lakebed mattered. What the old rules underestimated was the demand. How hard, how long, and at what rhythm the lakebed could drive a building when a major, distant subduction quake sent the right motion into the basin. The map carried the lake. It did not yet carry the worst version of the motion. All of this, wave, clay, resonance, shaped which buildings failed. Inside those buildings, the scale of the story shrank to geometry, position, and a few minutes of timing. Survival inside a collapse often depends on the space the wreckage accidentally leaves. A doorway holds. A corner refuses to close. One slab lands at an angle instead of falling flat. At Hospital Juárez, the same rhythm reached an 11-story tower in the old center at around 7:19, with patients, staff, and a maternity ward inside. A hospital should have been receiving the injured. That morning, it became one of the city's largest rescue sites. Days later, rescuers pulled newborns out alive. The press called them the miracle babies, and the name is understandable, but the story has been told more cleanly than the record allows. The numbers drift from account to account. The stable core is smaller and stronger. Several newborns survived under concrete for days. The physics under that survival is colder than the headline. Later reconstructions of the collapse describe part of one floor shearing sideways and sliding out from under the mass above, reducing the vertical load on the cribs. The old tubular steel cribs bent without snapping and held concrete inches above the mattresses. A newborn has margins an adult does not. A smaller body, less movement, different heat regulation, and less energy spent in a tight space. It reads like a miracle. It runs on voids, steel, temperature, time, and biology. While the city dug itself out, it also lost part of its sight. Televisa, the dominant broadcaster, lost its picture for much of the morning when its transmission structure failed. The broadcaster became part of the same collapse field it was trying to show. With no smartphones and with television wounded, radio carried the first usable map of the disaster. XEW and other stations read out addresses, places to dig, hospitals still standing, streets blocked, and names people were desperate to hear. The city learned its damage by voice. The record of the official response is harder than the slogan version. The government did move that first day. Naval units alone pulled hundreds of people from the rubble on September 19th. The easy line that authorities simply vanished for days does not survive the record. What the record does show is a response that began that same day and still fell short. It was fragmented, slow in places, and overwhelmed by hundreds of simultaneous failures across hospitals, apartment blocks, hotels, factories, and offices. A debt crisis sat behind the disaster as well, and the government hesitated before opening a broad international appeal. To officials, that hesitation could be procedure. To people clawing at concrete by hand, it looked like abandonment. So the city filled the gap. Students, workers, neighbors, doctors, soldiers, sailors, and strangers dug with crowbars, ropes, buckets, car jacks, and whatever could fit into spaces where machinery could kill the people it was meant to reach. Out of those improvised brigades came the rescuers later known as Los Topos, the moles, for crawling into voids no machine could enter. They became a formal group in 1986. In the first hours, they were people moving faster than any chain of command could assemble itself. At some collapse sites, a raised hand could stop the crowd because silence had a use. Engines stopped, voices stopped, and everyone listened for a knock or a voice under the slabs. The garment workers built their own aftermath. Women from the garment district, including survivors who had described locked or blocked exits, organized a union of their own. The quake exposed weak floors, overloaded buildings, and a labor system that had trapped people before the shaking began. The death toll is the one number in this story that will not settle. A later check of the Registro Civil documented 3,692 death certificates for September 19th, and another 228 for September 20th. A strict floor of the documented dead, not a final count. Later estimates, official and international, run far higher, into the 10,000 range and beyond. They do not reconcile because they are counting different things. Bodies recovered, hospital records, morgue records, missing people, family reports, unidentified remains. A clean number would make the story easier to tell. It would also be less honest. Mexico City was counting through broken channels, and the failure to land on one figure belongs to the disaster itself. What the city changed afterward is easier to prove. Emergency construction rules were issued within weeks, published in the Diario Oficial de la Federación. By 1987, the city's building code, the RCDF, was rewritten, legally requiring engineers to incorporate lake bed soil dynamics into every structural calculation. Mexico City had seismic provisions before 1985. The RCDF 1976 had already mapped the lake zone. What it underestimated was the actual demand, how hard, how long, and at what rhythm the lake bed could drive a mid-rise building when a major, distant subduction quake sent the right motion into the basin. The maps changed too. Isoperiod maps, a product of the post-quake engineering review, gave engineers a new portrait of the old lake, drawn in periods instead of water, showing what rhythm the ground at any given address could amplify. From then on, soil and building had to enter the same calculation. New institutions followed, and so did the seismic alert system built in the years after. That system belongs to the aftermath. Reading it backward into September 19th as a missed rescue bends the timeline. Its real place in the story is sharper. The quake showed that a distant rupture could give the capital a travel time window, because waves need time to cross the country. The lake bed stayed in the calculation because the city never got to undo its foundation. The clay is where it was. Mexico City is still sinking in places as groundwater extraction compacts the same soils. Older, vulnerable buildings still stand inside newer maps. In 2017, a different quake sent engineers back to the same question. What period does the ground under this address amplify, and what kind of building is standing on it? The mechanism is still there, even as the city's structural drawing has become more complicated. The number remains small. 2 seconds. Small for a collapsed hospital tower, for Tlatelolco, and for the garment district, where the weight above the columns was also the weight of the workday itself. But 2 seconds is enough time for a building to sway out, return, and meet the next push already weaker than before. The surface of Lake Texcoco is gone. On the engineering maps, the old lake bed still has a period. And every serious drawing in that city, to this day, has to answer it.